Colorado Territory, 1879. The dust had not yet settled when the shouting started. Lydia Fairburn stood in the middle of the wooden planked street in Gunnison, fists clenched, voice clear as the church bell. If your law only protects the powerful, then it is not justice. It is cowardice. Men scowled from the saloon porch. A woman near the general store pulled her son close. Sheriff Doyle spat tobacco in the dirt and stepped toward her. You ought to keep your mouth shut, Miss Fairburn. No place in this town for a woman stirrin' up trouble. Truth is not trouble, Lydia said, her eyes steady. That was when they came at her, not with fists but with words like knives, crazy, ungrateful, a disgrace. A boot scraped the dirt behind her. Someone threw a rotten apple. Another shouted, "Go back east, you don't belong here." She turned, grabbed her satchel and walked. She did not run. Not until she reached the edge of town and the open prairie where the wind carried no judgment. By the time the sun dipped low behind the mountains, she was 5 miles out with dust in her lungs and her boots blistered. She had nowhere to go. Her teaching position was gone, her boarding room empty, and her only crime had been speaking up for a 12-year-old girl who had been struck by the blacksmith for dropping a pail of nails. She had spoken up, loudly, publicly, and now she was alone until she saw him. A tall man on horseback crested the ridge ahead. His hat was low, casting his face in shadow, but as he got closer, the light caught a square jaw and a scar running just beneath his left eye. His horse was a chestnut with white socks. He wore worn gloves and a rifle slung across his back, but he made no move for it. He halted 10 paces in front of her. "You look like you fought a bear and lost," he said, voice deep but not unkind. "They chased me out," Lydia said, lifting her chin. He tilted his head. "You shoot someone," I spoke my mind. He was quiet for a beat, then swung down from his saddle. "That's so." He held out a canteen. "Well, that's what I like about you," she blinked. "You do not even know me." "I know enough. That town's full of cowards. I rode out of there 2 days ago myself." She took the canteen. The water was warm, but it steadied her hands. "You left by choice." "Maybe," he said, offering a half smile. "Name's Elias North. You?" "Lydia Fairburn." He nodded once. "Come on, there's a cabin another mile up." "Not mine, but I have permission. You can rest there tonight, then figure out what comes next." She hesitated, then followed. She did not have many options. And something in his voice, steady, quiet, sure made her believe she was not in danger. The cabin was small, tucked near a stand of cottonwoods. Inside was a lean-to stove, a cot, and a thick wool blanket. He handed her a tin of beans and lit a lantern. "You hungry?" he asked. "I have not eaten since morning." He handed her a plate and spoon. She sat across from him on the floor, legs crossed. "You always speak like that," he asked, looking at her over his plate. "Like what?" "Like you do not care if people like what you have to say." She shrugged. "I care, but I care more about the truth." Elias smiled, slow and real. "That takes guts." She looked at him. "And you?" "Why did you leave town?" He paused, chewing slow. "Sheriff wanted me to look the other way on a land grab. Family with 2 kids ranch was being taken by a banker with friends in high places. I said no." "What happened?" "I got a busted nose and packed my saddle." Lydia set her plate down. "So you stood up too," he nodded. "I do not like bullies." They sat in silence for a while. The fire hissed in the stove and the prairie wind whispered through the chinks in the walls. That night she slept on the cot. He took the floor. When she woke, he had already made coffee. "You have a plan?" he asked. "No," she admitted. "Well, maybe. I know of a schoolhouse in Creede that lost their teacher last spring. It is 50 miles, but I could write to them. I have a horse. I will take you." "I do not expect. I was headed that way anyhow." She eyed him. "You are a terrible liar," he smiled. "Yeah, well, I still mean it." They rode out that morning. The prairie stretched wide and golden. She had never ridden this far in open land before. He gave her his old gray mare and kept an easy pace. By nightfall, they made camp by a stream. Elias built the fire, and Lydia helped skin a rabbit he had caught in a snare. "You always travel alone?" she asked. "I have since my brother died," he said quietly. She glanced at him. "I am sorry," he shrugged. "It was 5 years ago." "Died in Kansas, helping a family cross the river during spring floods." "He sounds like someone I would have liked." "You would have." He looked at her. "He would have liked you too." There was something in the way he said it soft, warm, that made Lydia's chest tighten. She looked away. "You do not have to flatter me. I am not," he said. "I like how you talk, like you mean it." She smiled, small. "I do mean it." He reached across the fire, brushed a strand of hair from her face. His touch was gentle, his eyes steady. She did not pull away. "You are not like anyone I have met before," he said. "Neither are you." They sat like that until the fire burned low and the stars filled the sky. Something had shifted between them, not rushed, not loud, but sure. By the third day, they were close to Creede. She rode beside him, her skirt dusty, her hair lifted by the wind. He looked over and said, "What if I stayed a while, helped you get settled?" She looked at him, heart thudding. "I would like that." He reached over and took her hand where it rested on the saddle horn. "Good. Because I think I am starting to fall for you, Lydia Fairburn." She looked up at him, her voice barely above a whisper. "You are not alone in that." The mountains rose ahead. The town would come soon. But for now, the world was just the two of them, and something real was growing between them. Something strong, and neither of them had to be alone anymore. The road into Creede narrowed between two hills, the frost still clinging to the shadowed earth though the morning sun had climbed high. Lydia rode with her back straighter than the day before, her body remembering the rhythm of the saddle. Elias led the way without hurry, his gaze steady on the skyline ahead. When the first rooftops came into view low and gray, smoke curling from chimneys, Lydia reached for the leather strap across her shoulder. "I should write the school board straight away," she said, adjusting her grip on the satchel. "You will," Elias answered. "But you'll need a roof first." "I suppose I will." She looked at the cluster of buildings ahead. "I don't know where I'll find one." "I might," he said. "There's a widow south of town, rents a room come spring, name's Mrs. Corley, keeps chickens and doesn't ask questions." Lydia raised an eyebrow. "That last part matters," Elias nodded once. "To folks like us, I figure it does." They passed the livery, the clapboard church with its broken steeple, and the small mercantile with its porch swept clean. Children darted by with a dog trailing them, and a man hauling lumber paused to tip his hat. Mrs. Corley's homestead sat 2 miles past the last fence line, tucked behind a cluster of bare aspens. The house leaned slightly west, but the paint was fresh and the yard swept clear of snow. Elias dismounted and tied both horses. Lydia waited while he approached the door and knocked. An old woman with wiry white hair and a rifle leaned in the corner, opened it. After a few words, she looked past Elias to Lydia, then gave a curt nod and disappeared inside. "She says you can stay," Elias said, turning back. "There's a cot by the stove and a latch on the door." Lydia stepped down from the saddle, her legs aching. "What you tell her? That you speak plain, work hard, and don't cry easy." Lydia blinked. "I didn't expect flattery." "I wasn't offering any," he said, but his eyes lingered a second longer than they had to. Inside, the room was warm with the scent of sage and boiled oats. A kettle hissed on the stove. Lydia set her satchel near the cot and pulled off her gloves. "Mrs. Corley said nothing more, only pushed a bowl toward her and pointed to the table. Lydia sat, grateful. Elias stayed near the door, hands in his coat pockets. After the meal, he walked her to the edge of the yard. The wind had picked up, tugging at his coat hem. "You'll be all right here," he said. "I believe I will," she replied. He hesitated, then glanced toward the hills. "I've got work east of Turtle Creek. A rancher's herd needs tending. Might take a week." She studied his face. "You don't owe me anything, Elias. I know that." His jaw shifted slightly. "But I'd like to come back if you'd want that." "Yes," she said without pause. "I'd want that." He tipped his hat, then turned, boots crunching over the frost-hardened ground until his shape blurred into the distance. The days passed quietly. Lydia helped Mrs. Corley with feedings and laundry, and by week's end had received a reply from the school board, short but promising. They'd be glad to meet with her before the month's end. She borrowed a shawl and walked into town to send her letter of intent. The walk back was slower, the sun dipping low. The air tasted of pine and wood smoke, and Lydia found herself watching the road behind her more than ahead. Elias returned on the 9th evening, just as the fire was dying. She heard the hoofbeats before she saw him, and when he stepped inside, her heart moved before her words did. "You look tired," she said, setting down her sewing. That's ranch work, he answered, brushing snow from his coat, but it pays fair. He didn't sit right away. Instead, he looked around the room, then at her. I thought about you. She stood quietly, hands folded in front of her. I thought about you too. He crossed the space between them slow, like he didn't want to startle whatever had grown between them. When he reached her, he didn't touch her. He just looked, long and steady. I've never met a woman who makes me feel steady, he said. You do. She reached up, fingers brushing the collar of his coat. I've never trusted quiet the way I do when you're near. He leaned in then, no rush, no heat, just warmth. His forehead touched hers, and for a long moment, they stood breathing the same breath. The world narrowed to that small, flickering space between them. Mrs. Corley didn't say a word when he stayed that night, just left a folded quilt near the hearth. By morning, the hills were dusted white, and the first bluebird of the season flitted past the window. Lydia poured 2 cups of coffee, handed one to Elias, and sat beside him at the table. I think this place could be home, she said. He nodded, fingers grazing hers on the tabletop. Then I'll build something here with you. She looked at him, steady as she'd ever been. Yes, let's do that. Their hands stayed joined, the morning light warming the floorboards. The wind outside had calmed, and for the first time in weeks, Lydia felt the kind of stillness that comes after a storm, not silence, but peace earned by the weathering. The schoolhouse stood on a rise just north of the creek, weathered gray with a narrow bell tower and 2 windows shuttered against the wind. Lydia walked the perimeter with her coat drawn tight, taking note of the repairs she'd need to make before the board's decision at month's end. A hinge hung loose on the door and the stovepipe leaned slightly, but the bones of the building were strong. She ran her hand along the wood siding. It'll hold, she said softly. Elias stood behind her, arms crossed, watching the cloud shadows shift across the hills. Needs a new latch, he said. I'll fix it this week, and the stovepipe ought to be reset before the snow thickens. She turned, brushing a curl behind her ear. I didn't ask you to do that, I know. His expression didn't waver, but I want to. Inside, dust hung in the air like powder. The desks were still arranged in rows, each scarred with initials and ink stains. A faded slate leaned against the wall, and a pile of firewood lay untouched in the corner. Lydia opened the storeroom and found a stack of readers, their spines cracked but usable. She ran a finger down the side of one. Most of these belonged to the last teacher, she said. She left without warning. Elias leaned against the doorway. You afraid that's how it'll end for you? No, she closed the cupboard. I've never run from a thing in my life. He studied her for a moment, his voice quieter now. You gonna tell me what happened in Gunnison? Her gaze stayed on the floorboards. I saw a man strike a girl and no one spoke against it. I did. That was the end of it. That all. I told the sheriff he was complicit for looking away. The next morning, my position was gone and my room boarded. They don't forget fast in places like that. Elias stepped closer, his boots muted on the pine floor. You think I care what they said? I don't know what you care about. Her voice didn't rise, but it held a tension she couldn't quite tame. He placed a hand on the windowsill, his back to her. I care that you wouldn't let her be hurt in silence. That you walked out of town with nothing but your name and still didn't bend. She looked at his shoulders, the way his coat shifted with his breath. You were raised with someone who believed in that too, my brother. He didn't turn. He taught me to look people in the eye and mean my word. He didn't live long enough to see much good come from it, but he held the line. Lydia stepped beside him, her hand wrapping around her sleeve. I don't want to be the only one holding the line anymore. You're not, Elias said. They stood there until the bell outside creaked in the wind, a low groan that stirred the silence. Later that week, Elias repaired the stovepipe with a piece of tin he bartered from the blacksmith south of town. Lydia swept the floors and scrubbed the windows. She didn't ask for his help again. He offered it before she needed to. Mrs. Corley brought over a jar of pickled beets and a parcel wrapped in muslin. You'll need a proper dress if you're to stand before the board, she said, setting it on the table. Lydia unfolded it carefully. The fabric was dark green, simple but finely stitched. I can't accept this, she said. You can, Mrs. Corley replied. I taught in Missouri before I buried my husband. I know what it means to step into a room where you're not expected to lead. Lydia's hands lingered on the hem. Thank you. That night, Elias returned with a split knuckle and a sack of flour. Rancher shorted me $1, he said. Didn't matter. She took his hand, rinsed it in warm water, and wrapped it in cloth. He didn't flinch when she touched the bruise. You always fix what's broken, he asked. Only what matters. His eyes held hers. And what do I count as? She didn't look away. Something I'm not willing to lose. They didn't speak more that evening. He took the chair by the fire and she sat across from him with her mending. The quiet between them wasn't absence, it was presence, full and certain. The morning of the board's visit, snow threatened but didn't fall. Lydia dressed in the green gown and walked to the schoolhouse alone. Elias waited outside with a rope coiled at his side, his eyes tracking the clouds. You'll be fine, he said. She nodded. Stay close, I'm not going far. Inside, the board sat stiff-backed at the front, 3 men and a woman in a dark bonnet. They asked questions about curriculum, discipline, attendance. Lydia answered without faltering, her voice even, her hands still. The woman in the bonnet leaned forward. You were dismissed from your last position. Why? Lydia met her gaze. Because I refused to be silent when silence would have made me complicit. The woman didn't speak again, but she didn't look away either. When Lydia stepped outside, Elias stood with his coat open and a crow perched on the fence post beyond. She walked to him, slow and steady. Well, he asked, they'll send word. Her voice didn't betray the nerves in her stomach. But I said what I came to say. He looked at her closely. You don't bend, do you? She shook her head. Not when it matters. He reached for her hand, fingers warm. Good, then I'll know what I've got. She didn't speak, just let her fingers tighten around his. The wind stirred the pine branches, and somewhere far off, a train whistle echoed across the valley. They stood there, hand in hand, and the world felt wide open. The letter arrived 3 days later, carried by a ranch hand who passed through just after dawn. Lydia had been feeding the hens behind Mrs. Corley's house, her shawl pulled tight against the wind, when she heard the knock. She wiped her hands on her apron and opened the door to find the young man holding out a folded envelope with her name written in stiff, careful script. She read it once, then again, her fingers tightening around the paper. Elias was splitting firewood at the edge of the yard. When he looked up, she was already walking toward him, boots crunching over the frost-hardened ground. They accepted me, she said, voice calm but unable to hide the tremble underneath. He set the axe down and dusted his hands on his trousers. Course they did. They want me to start the first Monday after the thaw. That's just over 2 weeks, he nodded, eyes steady on hers. Then we'll get the place ready. Lydia folded the letter and tucked it inside her coat. They offered a stipend for supplies. I'll need to ride into Monte Vista before then. It's the only town nearby with proper slates and books. I'll go with you, he said. She tilted her head. You don't need to. I want to. You'll need help with the hauling, she hesitated. It's a 2-day ride there and back. I've got no place else to be. They left the next morning, just after first light. Mrs. Corley handed Lydia a jar of boiled eggs and a pair of wool mitts stitched from old flannel. You'll find good folks in Monte Vista, she said. Just don't expect them to be loud about it. They followed the San Luis Valley south, riding between fields still stiff with last snow. The road was quiet, save for the rustle of cotton grass and the occasional hawk overhead. They passed no one. Lydia broke the silence first. You ever think about settling somewhere permanent? Elias nudged his horse around a patch of ice. Used to, before the war. After that, I never stayed long in one place. You were in the army, cavalry, he said. Mostly border patrol near the Arkansas, she glanced over. How long? 2 years. I left after my brother died, couldn't stomach the orders after that. They didn't speak for a while. The wind picked up, brushing loose strands of hair across Lydia's cheek. Did you ever consider teaching? She asked. He glanced at her. Me, you've got a steady way about you. Children would listen. He laughed once, low. I can barely read half the time. She looked over. I could teach you. He didn't answer right away. Then, you think I could learn? I wouldn't have said it if I didn't. They camped that night near a bend in the Rio Grande, the river low and sluggish under a crust of melting ice. Elias built the fire while Lydia unwrapped the eggs and a round of flatbread. They sat on either side of the flames, the horses tethered just beyond. Lydia watched the sparks rise. I never thought I'd end up here. He leaned back on his elbows. Where'd you think you'd be? Back east, maybe. Married to a banker's son, pouring tea and pretending not to notice when no one listened. He looked at her, the firelight catching in his eyes. Glad you didn't. So am I. After they ate, she pulled a thin volume from her bag and offered it to him. The letters are large. And the stories are simple. He took the book, turned it in his hands. You sure? You said you wanted to stay, she said. If you're going to, you'll need more than your hands. He opened the first page and studied the words. She moved beside him, her shoulder brushing his. That one's Fox, she said, pointing. Fox, he repeated it. Fox, she smiled. Exactly. They rode into Monte Vista the next day, just before noon. The streets were muddy with meltwater and lined with covered wagons and drays. Lydia headed straight for the general store while Elias took their horses to the livery. Inside, the store was dim but warm. Lydia spoke quietly to the shopkeeper, explaining what she needed: chalk, slates, writing tablets, and a ledger. He nodded and began gathering items from the shelves. Elias arrived as she was counting coins from her purse. He didn't speak, just stood beside her, his presence solid. She looked up. They have everything I need. He watched the shopkeeper wrap the supplies in oilcloth. Good. As they left, she glanced sideways at him. You didn't ask what I bought you. I didn't know you had. She handed him a small cloth bundle. Inside was a writing slate with his initials carved into the edge. He ran a thumb over the smooth surface. You did this, she nodded. I figured we'd start with letters. Once you've got those, we'll move to sentences. He didn't say anything for a while, just looked at the slate like it was something far more valuable. When they made camp that night, he read his first word, hill, slow and careful. She didn't correct his pace, only nodded each time he got it right. As the fire burned low, he turned toward her, voice quiet. I've never had anyone believe in me like this. She didn't hesitate. Then it's time someone did. He leaned in, not with urgency, but with certainty. When their lips met, it was soft and sure, like something they'd been building toward all along. I'm not going anywhere, he said against her hair. She nodded against his chest. Good. Because I don't want to do this without you. The stars above them blinked steady and cold, but their world had grown warm, and they both knew it would hold. The thaw came quiet and slow, like the land itself was waking from something deeper than sleep. Patches of brown bled through the snowbanks, and the river ran fuller each day. Lydia stood in the doorway of the schoolhouse early one morning, sleeves rolled from brushing soot off the stove, and watched a pair of crows pick at the earth where the frost had finally let go. Behind her, Elias swept the last of the sawdust from where he'd refit the doorframe. His hair was damp at the temples, and his shirt sleeves were pushed up past his elbows. You've got a look about you, he said, glancing up. I was thinking how long it took for this place to feel like mine. He leaned on the broom handle. And now, she turned toward him, now it feels like ours. That night they walked the ridge above the valley after supper, the last light catching on the grass just beginning to green. His hand brushed hers as they walked, and though neither reached for the other, the space between them felt full. I've been thinking, Elias said, eyes on the far hills. About land. What kind of land? Past the ridge near the river bend. It's quiet out there. No one's claimed it yet. I asked around. She stopped, dust rising around her hem. You thinking of settling it? I'm thinking of building something we don't have to leave. Her breath caught, but her voice stayed even. You do that with me. I wouldn't do it without you. They stood still, the wind threading between them. There's a man in town, she said. Mr. Baird. He's been offering seeds and a plowshare to anyone willing to put in the work. Elias nodded slowly. Then maybe it's time we bought a shovel. The school term began with a dozen children, most in boots too big and coats too thin. Lydia learned their names by the second day, their habits by the third. One boy chewed the ends of his pencil. A girl in the front row read aloud with her whole body, leaning into each sentence like it might carry her somewhere. Elias came by in the evenings after his work at the livery, staying just long enough to walk her home or bring a sack of oats or a paper of nails. They spoke less across the weeks, but what passed between them didn't need naming. One evening, as she copied arithmetic problems on the slate, he sat with his chin resting in his hand, watching her. I've got an extra shirt, he said. She didn't pause. You planning to move it into Mrs. Corley's? No, he said. I was thinking it might hang better next to yours. She turned to face him. You asking me to share a roof? I'm asking you to build one with me. She set the chalk down and crossed the room, stopping in front of him. I want that. His mouth quirked, but it wasn't a smile. I don't have much. I've never cared about much, just steady, just good. He stood slowly, and when he kissed her, it was with a gentleness that made her knees soften and her heart steady all at once. By early summer, they cleared the land near the bend. Elias built the frame with his own hands, and Lydia planted wildflowers along the path that led to the door. The house rose slow, beam by beam, and when it had walls and a roof, they moved in with nothing but a mattress, a stove, and 3 books. Mrs. Corley gave them a carved wooden bowl. The children at the school brought her a stone with their names painted on it. Elias hung it near the kitchen window. One morning, as they sat on the porch watching the sun rise over the grassland, Lydia laid her hand over her belly. I've been feeling strange, she said. He looked over. Sick? No, just full. He went very still. Do you think? She nodded once, eyes shining. He reached for her hand, pulled it to his chest. You sure? Yes. He leaned down, kissed her palm. You're everything I never thought I'd find. They sat like that until the light warmed the fields and a breeze stirred the curtains behind them. Years passed, quiet but full. Elias taught himself to read by the firelight, one sentence at a time. Lydia ran the school until the day she couldn't, and then she taught from home, her students sitting cross-legged on their kitchen floor. Their son was born in January, red-faced and loud, with his father's eyes and Lydia's stubborn jaw. They named him Samuel Elias Fairburn North, and when he took his first steps, it was across the floor of the house his father had built. In time, the house grew. A second room, a root cellar, a fence for the hens. Elias planted trees along the edge of the field, and Lydia dried herbs by the window. They grew older, but not apart. Every Sunday they walked the ridge hand in hand, the land rolling out before them like a promise kept. The past stayed behind them, and the road ahead no longer seemed uncertain. They had built something enduring, not just a home or a school or a life, but a love that had grown from hardship and held firm through every season, and they never had to be alone again.